For decades, every textbook told you the same clean, simple story. Modern humans evolved in Africa, and then, in one dramatic exodus, roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago, a single small band of pioneers walked out and became every non-African person alive today. Neat, tidy, settled science. Except new genetic evidence recovered from ancient bones, cross-referenced against the genomes of thousands of living people, has just proven that story is wrong. Not wrong in the sense that humans didn't come from Africa. They did. Wrong in almost every other detail. There wasn't one migration. There wasn't one moment. And the humans who left were interbreeding with other ancient populations tens of thousands of years earlier than anyone believed possible. This is the story of how DNA quietly dismantled one of the most famous narratives in modern science. And what actually replaced it is stranger, messier, and far more human than the simple story we were taught. If you enjoy watching settled science get rewritten in real time by better evidence, go ahead and hit that like button now, because this channel exists to track exactly these kinds of quiet revolutions in what we think we know. Let's start with the version of the story that most people still believe, because understanding exactly how confident scientists were is what makes this reversal so significant. For nearly 30 years, the dominant framework in human evolutionary biology was called the Out of Africa model. It held that Homo sapiens evolved exclusively on the African continent, and that every 1,000 years ago. This wasn't a fringe idea. It was built on genuinely rigorous genetic detective work, using mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down only through mothers, and Y chromosome DNA, which is passed down only through fathers. Large-scale genome projects, including the HapMap project and the 1000 Genomes project, consistently pointed toward the same conclusion that non-African populations share a relatively recent common ancestor, and that the deepest, oldest branches of the human family tree are found in Africa. That last part gave the theory real scientific weight, since African populations do, in fact, carry the highest genetic diversity on the planet, exactly what you would expect if humanity's oldest roots sit there. For a long time, this framework did its job well. It explained the fossil record reasonably well. It explained the genetic diversity gradient as you move away from Africa. And it gave scientists a clean, testable hypothesis. But clean, testable hypotheses have a way of surviving right up until someone finds a piece of evidence that simply refuses to fit. That evidence started arriving from an unexpected direction, not from newly unearthed fossils, but from Neanderthals. Here's the problem researchers kept running into. If modern humans left Africa in one single wave around 50,000 years ago, and then bumped into Neanderthal populations already living across Europe and Asia, the genetic signature of that encounter should look a certain way. It should look like one clean pulse of interbreeding, at one point in time, in one general region. For years, that is roughly what scientists believed they were seeing, but the tools available to test that assumption were limited. Researchers had sequenced hundreds of thousands of modern human genomes by this point, yet only a small handful of complete Neanderthal genomes existed anywhere, recovered from just 3 sites, one in Croatia and 2 in Russia. Comparing an enormous, richly detailed modern dataset against a tiny, sparse ancient one meant that subtler patterns could easily stay hidden. That changed in the summer of 2024, when a team led by geneticist Joshua Akey and researcher Liming Lee at Princeton University published a study in the journal Science that flipped the entire narrative on its head. Instead of only searching for Neanderthal, DNA inside modern human genomes, the way virtually every previous study had done, Akey's team flipped the search around. They went looking for modern human DNA hiding inside Neanderthal genomes instead. Using a machine learning tool called IBD-Mix, designed specifically to detect fragments of shared ancestry buried deep inside genetic code, the team compared the 3 known Neanderthal genomes against roughly 2,000 modern human genomes. What they found did not match a single clean pulse of interbreeding at all. It matched at least 2 entirely separate waves of contact, occurring tens of thousands of years apart. The first wave showed evidence of interbreeding between 200,000 and 250,000 years ago. The second showed a completely separate pulse between 100,000 and 120,000 years ago, layered on top of the more familiar interbreeding event around 50 to 60,000 years ago that most people already knew about. This meant modern humans and Neanderthals had been crossing paths and crossing genes repeatedly across a span of time roughly 5 times longer than the old textbook timeline ever suggested. If a single study rewriting 200,000 years of human contact sounds like the kind of discovery worth knowing about before your friends do, this is exactly why it helps to subscribe, because these quiet paradigm shifts happen more often than most people realize. What makes this finding especially difficult to dismiss is that it didn't stand alone. A separate study published the year before in the journal Current Biology, involving geneticist Sarah Tishkoff, took a different approach entirely. Instead of relying only on ancient Neanderthal remains, that team compared a Neanderthal fossil genome directly against the genomes of 180 people sampled from across the African continent. Despite using an entirely different dataset and method, the researchers landed on strikingly similar conclusions, identifying genetic contact between modern humans and Neanderthals reaching back roughly 250,000 years. Two independent research groups using two different genetic approaches, arriving at nearly the same impossible-sounding timeline, is precisely the kind of convergence that turns a provocative claim into an accepted fact. And the genetic data lines up with something the fossil record had been quietly hinting at for years without anyone fully connecting them. Dots. Paleoanthropologists studying skulls recovered from caves in Israel had long noticed something strange. These skulls looked mostly like modern humans, but carried unusual features, including heavier brow ridges that seemed to echo Neanderthal anatomy. Dating techniques placed these skulls at roughly 100,000 years old, sitting almost precisely inside the second wave of interbreeding the genetic study identified. Separately, a skull fragment recovered in Greece, dated to about approximately 210,000 years old, displayed features that don't cleanly sort into either category, aligning suspiciously well with the very first proposed wave of contact. For years, these fossils were treated as confusing outliers, hard to classify oddities sitting at the edges of the accepted timeline. Now, they look like exactly what the genetic data predicted they should be. There's something quietly satisfying about watching a decades-old fossil, once dismissed as a strange anomaly, suddenly click into place the moment better genetic tools became available to explain it. Sometimes the evidence was sitting in a museum drawer the entire time, waiting for the right technology to finally translate what it was trying to say. This is a good moment to pause and ask why this discovery matters beyond simply moving a few numbers around on a timeline. If you're finding this rewrite of human history as fascinating as I do, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to get into what this actually means for the fate of the Neanderthals themselves, and it's not what most people assume. The Aki team's research didn't stop at identifying when contact happened. Using the same genetic modeling, they also produced a striking estimate about Neanderthal population size itself, suggesting their breeding population may have been smaller than previously believed, somewhere around 2,400 individuals, rather than earlier estimates closer to 3,400. A population that small is fragile. It doesn't take a catastrophic extinction event to make a group that size disappear. It just takes sustained contact with a much larger expanding population over tens of thousands of years. And that reframes the entire disappearance of the Neanderthals in a genuinely different light. Rather than modern humans wiping out Neanderthals through violence, disease, or direct competition in some single dramatic collapse, the genetic evidence increasingly points towards something slower and, in its own way, stranger. Repeated waves of contact, repeated interbreeding, generation after generation, gradually folding a smaller, once distinct population into a larger one, until the smaller group's distinct identity simply stopped existing as a separate lineage. The Neanderthal genome estimates suggest they may have contributed somewhere between 2.5% and just under 4% of their DNA into the modern human population, a genetic signature still detectable in people alive today across Europe and Asia. Neanderthals, in other words, may not have gone extinct in the way we usually picture that word. They may have simply been absorbed. Now here's where the story gets even more complicated, because the old model didn't just get the timing of contact wrong, it also assumed something else that turned out to be far too simple, that Africa itself was a single, stable, unchanging source population before anyone left the continent at all. A separate line of research, led by geneticists Francesco Montanaro and Vasily Pankratov, working across universities in Italy and Estonia, challenged exactly this assumption. Using a newly developed method that combines deep learning neural networks with traditional population genetics, published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, the team found evidence of a massive population turnover happening inside Africa itself, shifting from east to west in the period before humans ever left the continent. According to their modeling, this internal migration was so significant that it may account for up to 90% of the genetic ancestry found in West African populations today. This wasn't a side detail. It fundamentally reshapes what the population that left Africa even means, because that population wasn't a fixed, isolated group quietly waiting in one place. It was already the product of massive internal movement and mixing within the continent, long before anyone crossed into Eurasia at all. Think about what that actually implies. The old model imagined a relatively simple family tree, branching cleanly from Africa outward. The new evidence describes something closer to a river delta. Branches splitting, merging back together, splitting again. Entire populations moving, mixing, and reshaping each other, both within Africa and far beyond it, across hundreds of thousands of years. And the complications inside Africa don't stop there. For years, the working assumption in genetics was straightforward, that interbreeding with archaic, non-modern humans was something that happened to people after they left Africa, out in Europe's. And Asia, where Neanderthals and Denisovans were waiting. Africa itself, in this picture, stayed genetically untouched by any archaic lineage. A team of computational biologists at UCLA, Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman, decided to test that assumption directly. Publishing in the journal Science Advances, they analyzed whole genome data from 405 individuals across 4 West African populations, the Yoruba, the Isan, the Mende, and the Gambian. Rather than comparing this data against a known archaic reference genome, the way earlier Neanderthal studies had done, they used a statistical method that could detect the genetic fingerprint of an extinct population without ever having a fossil to compare it against. What they found was a ghost, a previously unknown archaic hominin, one that branched off from the human family tree even before Neanderthals and Denisovans split from our own lineage, appears to have interbred with the ancestors of modern West Africans. Depending on the population studied, this mystery lineage accounts for somewhere between 2 and 19% of an individual's genetic ancestry. Some of these inherited genetic segments appear linked to functions like immune response, tumor suppression, and hormone regulation, hinting that these ancient genes may have actively helped modern populations survive and adapt. Nobody has ever found a skull, a jawbone, or a single bone fragment belonging to this hominin. Its entire existence has been reconstructed purely from the mathematics hidden inside living people's DNA. And it turns out the traffic wasn't only happening within Africa. A separate body of research has found that Neanderthal DNA itself made a return trip, carried back into Africa by migrating populations roughly 20,000 years ago, contributing an average of around 0.5% to the genomes of Africans alive today. Put all of this together, and the old, tidy boundary line, archaic interbreeding happens out there, Africa stays pure, simply does not hold up. Africa was never a genetically frozen starting point quietly waiting to be left behind. It was its own sprawling, active site of migration, mixing, and contact with lineages science hasn't even fully identified yet. If discovering an entire extinct species of human, one science has never found a single bone for hiding inside modern DNA sounds. Like the kind of story worth knowing before it goes viral somewhere else first. That's exactly why it's worth subscribing right now. So does this mean the entire out-of-Africa theory is false? Here's where careful, honest science actually matters more than a dramatic headline. A 2025 study out of the University of Tokyo, drawing on whole genome sequencing from both modern and ancient populations, reaffirmed the core finding that still holds up under all this new complexity. Non-African populations do share a common ancestor who left the African continent, with genetic estimates still centering that departure around 60,000 years ago. That much of the original theory remains solidly intact. What has completely fallen apart is the idea that this was one clean, isolated event involving one population, leaving one time, meeting one other group of ancient humans exactly once. The broad outline survived. Almost every specific detail underneath it did not. If you're the kind of person who wants the full, complicated truth rather than the simplified version, that's exactly the kind of content this channel is built around. So consider subscribing before we get into what made all of this possible in the first place. None of this would have been discoverable without an entirely separate scientific revolution happening in parallel, the ability to sequence extremely degraded ancient DNA at all. This field owes an enormous debt to geneticist Svante Pääbo, who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 specifically for his work developing the techniques used to sequence the first Neanderthal genome. Those same techniques were what allowed an entirely different research team, working from a single finger bone recovered in Siberia's Denisova cave, to identify Denisovans as a distinct archaic population in the first place, a lineage now known to have interbred most heavily with the ancestors of modern Melanesians and Papuans, who carry the highest Denisovan ancestry of any population studied. Before Pääbo's work, the idea of reliably extracting usable genetic information from bones, tens of thousands of years old, sounded almost like science fiction. Degrades, fragments, and becomes contaminated with modern genetic material extremely easily. The methods developed to overcome that problem didn't just enable one landmark discovery. They opened the door to everything that came after, including the Agi team's 2024 reversal, the Tishkov comparison study, the UCLA ghost lineage discovery, and the broader wave of ancient genome research still actively rewriting our understanding of human history today. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Every one of these discoveries depended on a tool that didn't exist 20 years ago, which raises an obvious, slightly unsettling question. If the timeline shifted this dramatically once scientists gained the ability to compare ancient and modern genomes with genuine precision, what does that suggest about how much more is still sitting undiscovered? Encoded in genetic material, we simply don't yet have the tools to properly read. There's an important side effect of all this that rarely makes it into headlines. For most of modern history, popular imagination treated pure ancestry as the default assumption. The idea that any given population descended cleanly from one lineage, undisturbed by outside contact until relatively recent history. Genetics keeps demonstrating the opposite. Every population studied so far, from Europeans carrying Neanderthal DNA to Melanesians carrying substantial Denisovan ancestry to West Africans carrying traces of an entirely unnamed archaic hominin, turns out to be a mixture, layered from repeated contact across hundreds of thousands of years. There is no genetically pure starting point hiding anywhere in the human story. There never was one. There's also a broader human dimension to this story that's easy to lose inside the science. For most of the 20th century, human evolution was often described using language that implied cleaner, more separate categories, distinct species replacing one another in tidy succession. What DNA keeps revealing instead is contact, overlap, and mixing, not once but repeatedly, across enormous stretches of time and multiple separate populations, and archaic lineages, some of which we can only detect mathematically and have never actually seen. Modern humans carry Neanderthal ancestry. Some populations carry ancestry from Denisovans. Others carry ancestry from a ghost lineage nobody has ever found a fossil for. Populations within Africa itself turn out to be far more genetically complex and interconnected than the old single-source model ever accounted for. The deeper researchers look, the less our species resembles a simple branching tree, and the more it resembles an enormous, tangled genetic conversation that never really stopped. Perhaps the most important lesson buried inside this story has very little to do with Neanderthals, ghost hominins, or ancient exoduses, and everything to do with how science itself actually progresses. The out-of-Africa model wasn't destroyed by bad researchers or sloppy evidence. It was refined piece by piece, by rigorous scientists building better tools, gathering more genomes, and having the intellectual honesty to admit when new evidence complicated a clean, comfortable story. That is not a failure of science. That is exactly what good science is supposed to do. And it leaves us with a strange, quietly humbling thought to close on. Every person watching this right now is walking around with a genome shaped by encounters, migrations, and population collisions that stretch back hundreds of thousands of years, which left no trace in any history book, because no one alive at the time could have known they were happening at all. The full story is still being written, quite literally, inside genetic material. Scientists are only now learning how to properly read. Whatever the next major genome study uncovers, one thing already seems certain. The simple version of the story we grew up with was never the whole truth. It was just the first draft.